There's a mountain sitting nearly 200 kilometers inland from the Persian Gulf Coast, rising almost 3,000 meters above a city that most people outside the Middle East couldn't place on a map. And twice now, in the middle of this war, American airstrikes have hit it. Not Karg Island, not the Strait of Hormuz, not Natanz or Fordo or Pickaxe Mountain, a mountain overlooking the city of Shiraz, hundreds of kilometers away from every target you've heard about in every other breakdown of this conflict. And according to residents on the ground, something happened the moment that mountain got hit that nobody was expecting to hear about at all. The mountain is called Mount Derak, local name Ku-i-Barfi. It sits directly west and northwest of the city of Shiraz, in Iran's Fars province, part of the Zagros mountain range, rising to an elevation of roughly 2,900 meters according to its own geographic documentation. For most of its existence, it's been known for exactly nothing military. It's a sedimentary rock formation that hikers have climbed since the 1840s. And yet, according to open source intelligence tracking compiled through Global Security's own overhead imagery digest, satellite imagery confirmed a U.S. strike on a communications facility at Mount Derak overlooking Shiraz during the night of July 20th into July 21st this year. A communications facility on a hiking mountain, 200 kilometers from the coast. Let's talk about why that specific detail matters more than it might sound like at first. Every major target we've covered throughout this entire war sits along the coast or inside the missile and nuclear infrastructure belt running through the center of the country: Karg Island, Bandar Abbas, the Strait of Hormuz, Natanz, Fordo, Isfahan, Pickaxe Mountain. Every single one of those locations makes sense the moment you hear about it because they're all tied directly to oil, missiles, or nuclear material, the obvious categories anyone would expect a war like this to target. Mount Derak doesn't fit that pattern at all, and that's exactly the point. According to reporting from Iran International, a resident in Shiraz sent footage and a first-hand account describing a fresh strike on Mount Derak and told the outlet something that should genuinely stop you. The resident said that satellite interference in the area disappeared immediately after the attack and suggested the site may have housed a jamming tower. Read that again. A local resident, someone actually living underneath this mountain, reported that whatever was jamming satellite signals in that part of Shiraz simply stopped working the moment American munitions hit the site. That's not confirmed by any official U.S. military statement. I want to be completely upfront about that, because a serious breakdown doesn't dress up a resident's account as an official Pentagon confirmation. As of the most recent reporting available, there has been no formal CENTCOM press release specifically naming Mount Derak as a designated target, the way CENTCOM has directly confirmed strikes on Karg Island or on coastal radar sites elsewhere in this war. What we have is open-source satellite confirmation of an impact at that location, independent social media reporting geolocating the strike, and a direct account from someone on the ground describing the jamming disappearing afterward. That's meaningfully different from an official confirmed kill statement, and I think it's important to hold that distinction rather than blur it just because the story is compelling. But here's why even that unofficial picture deserves your full attention. Because this wasn't the first time Mount Derak was struck in this war. According to that same Iran International reporting, this fresh strike in July came after an earlier reported attack on the exact same site back in March of this year. 2 separate strikes, months apart, on the same obscure mountain overlooking the same inland city, each time reportedly targeting whatever sits at that summit. That's not a random one-off hit. That's a target the United States has returned to, deliberately, more than once, across different phases of this entire war. Now let's talk about why Shiraz itself matters, because the city underneath this mountain isn't some minor town caught in the crossfire either. According to independent open source reporting circulated through analysts tracking this conflict, Shiraz sits roughly 200 kilometers inland from the Gulf Coast, and it's home to a major airbase along with a significant portion of Iran's domestic military electronics industry. That second detail is the one that should really catch your attention: Iran's military electronics industry. In a city sitting directly beneath a mountain that residents believe housed a jamming installation. Put those two facts side by side and a picture starts to form. A mountain overlooking a city that manufactures military electronics, hosting what looks like a signals jamming site, gets struck not once, but twice during this war. That's not a coincidental target. That's the kind of infrastructure a modern military specifically hunts for, because jamming in electronic warfare installations don't announce themselves the way a missile battery or a radar dome does. They hide in plain sight, on unremarkable terrain, doing quiet, continuous damage to communications and navigation systems for months or years before anyone outside the local population even notices they exist. Let's talk about what jamming actually does in a modern war like this one, because it's easy to underestimate just how disruptive it is. Satellite communications, GPS navigation, and increasingly systems like Starlink have become absolutely central to how modern militaries and even civilian populations coordinate during a conflict. According to Iran International's own reporting from earlier this year, security agents in the cities across Iran have specifically been searching for Starlink satellite internet signals moving through neighborhoods with detection devices, precisely because access to uncensored, unjammed satellite communication has become one of the most contested pieces of infrastructure in this entire war. If a jamming site sitting on Mount Derak was disrupting exactly that kind of signal across an entire region of Fars province, taking it out isn't a symbolic gesture. It's a direct strike against Iran's ability to control the flow of information and communication across a significant portion of its own territory. And this connects to something bigger happening across the country during that same stretch of the war. According to that global security overhead imagery tracking, the same July 20th to 21st window that saw the Mount Derak strike also coincided with satellite imagery confirming active fires and thermal anomalies breaking out on Karg Island, a burning oil tanker with a visible spill in the Strait of Hormuz following an IRGC strike, and CENTCOM launching what was described at the time as a 9th consecutive night of strikes specifically designed, in the command's own words, to further degrade Iranian military capabilities used to threaten commercial shipping. Mount Derak wasn't an isolated incident sitting apart from the rest of this war. It was one piece of a coordinated multi-front strike wave hitting Iran across an enormous geographic spread from an island in the Gulf to the Strait itself, all the way inland to a mountain outside Shiraz, in a single overlapping window of days. Let's also bring in the other target that surfaced in Shiraz during this same period, because it reinforces exactly how much attention this specific city was suddenly drawing. According to separate open-source intelligence tracking, the IRGC's Tharala base was also reportedly struck in Shiraz during this same stretch of the war. Tharala is one of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps regional command structures, and having it specifically named alongside the Mount Derak strike tells you this wasn't a single, isolated target of opportunity. This was a city that had quietly become a genuine node of military significance, sitting far enough inland that most casual observers of this war never had a reason to look at it closely, until suddenly, within the same 48-hour window, it had two separate confirmed or reported strikes hitting two completely different kinds of military infrastructure. Now, here's where I want to slow down and be very precise about what's actually established here versus what remains genuinely uncertain, because that distinction is the whole point of taking this seriously rather than just running with a dramatic headline. What's confirmed through satellite imagery, independently reviewed by open-source geolocation analysts, is that an impact occurred at Mount Derak on the night of July 20th into July 21st. What's confirmed through direct resident reporting to Iran International is that a fresh strike happened on that same site, and that satellite jamming in the surrounding area stopped functioning immediately afterward. What remains unofficial, and should be treated as an informed assessment rather than a confirmed fact, is the specific identification of the site as a jamming tower, since no U.S. military statement has publicly named it that way, and no independent inspection of the wreckage has been conducted by a neutral party that we can cite here. That's honest uncertainty, not a weakness in the story. If anything, it's exactly what makes a target like this one so different from everything else we've covered in this war. Every strike on Karg Island, every strike on Fordo, every threat against Pickaxe Mountain comes with official statements, named U.S. officials, quoted assessments from institutions like CENTCOM or the IAEA or the Institute for Science and International Security. Mount Derak has almost none of that. It's a target that surfaced almost entirely through open-source satellite analysts, geolocated social media footage, and a single resident's first-hand account sent directly to a news outlet. That's what it looks like when a war's target list expands into places nobody was specifically tracking, revealed only because the people living underneath it happened to notice their internet connection changed the moment the bombs landed. Let's talk about what this tells us about how this war has actually evolved over its many months of fighting, because that evolution matters more than any single strike. In the earliest phases of this conflict, back when Operation Midnight Hammer targeted Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan, and later when Operation Epic Fury expanded the target set to coastal radar, naval bases, and missile storage, the entire war fit a fairly predictable logic. Hit the nuclear infrastructure, hit the missile capability, hit the naval assets threatening shipping. Every target made sense within a narrow, understandable military logic tied directly to the stated goals of preventing a nuclear weapon and reopening the Strait of Hormuz. Mount Derak represents something different. It's a target that only makes sense once you understand the war has moved into a phase focused on Iran's broader command, control, and communications architecture, the invisible infrastructure that lets a government coordinate its military response, jam enemy communications, monitor its own population, and maintain control over information flow during an active war. That's a much quieter kind of target than a missile bunker or an oil terminal, but arguably just as consequential, because a government that loses its ability to communicate and coordinate internally starts making the exact kind of uncoordinated, chaotic decisions that speed up its own collapse. And that shift toward this kind of target set tells you something about how confident American and Allied intelligence has become at identifying targets that don't advertise themselves the obvious way a radar dome or a naval base does. Finding a jamming installation disguised on an unremarkable hiking mountain 200 kilometers inland from anything anyone was watching closely requires a level of persistent intelligence gathering that goes well beyond simply watching satellite imagery of known military facilities. It requires understanding exactly where an adversary would choose to hide something specifically, because nobody would think to look there. Let's zoom out and think about what it means for Iran that a target like this even exists on the list at all. If Mount Derak really was functioning as a jamming site disrupting satellite communications across a meaningful stretch of Fars province, then striking it twice within a single war isn't just a tactical footnote. It's a direct hit against Iran's ability to control its own information environment in one of its more significant interior cities. A city that, according to open source reporting on Iran's military-industrial base, plays a real role in producing the electronics that feed the broader Iranian defense industry. You don't get to keep disrupting enemy communications and controlling your own population's access to outside information indefinitely if the specific hardware doing that job keeps getting found and destroyed, no matter how well you've hidden it on an unremarkable mountainside. So here's where all of this actually sits right now as you're watching this. A previously unremarkable mountain outside Shiraz struck once in March and again in July, according to open source and resident reporting, apparently functioning as a jamming installation, disrupting satellite communications across the surrounding region. A separate IRGC command target, Tharla Base, reportedly struck in that same city during that same window, both discoveries surfacing not through official Pentagon press releases, but through satellite geolocation analysts and a resident's own account of the jamming disappearing the moment the strike happened. And all of it occurring inside the exact same 48-hour period that saw fires break out on Karg Island, a burning tanker in the Strait of Hormuz, and CENTCOM launching its 9th consecutive night of strikes against Iran's broader military capability. That's the honest, fully sourced version of why this target genuinely caught people off guard. Not because it's the most powerful strike of the war. It almost certainly isn't, compared to a 14-bomb bunker buster raid on Fordo or a 16-vessel strike against Iranian mine layers in the Gulf. It caught people off guard because nobody was watching a hiking mountain outside an inland city for military significance right up until satellite imagery and a local resident's account revealed that it had apparently been hiding exactly the kind of infrastructure this war has increasingly come to depend on identifying and eliminating: the quiet, unglamorous communications and jamming architecture that lets a government fight a modern war at all. Here's what I'd genuinely watch for going forward. Watch whether CENTCOM or the Pentagon ever issues an official statement specifically naming Mount Derak, because right now this entire story rests on open source and resident level reporting rather than a confirmed military statement, and that gap is worth tracking closely rather than assuming it will simply be filled in later. Watch whether more of these previously unremarkable inland sites start surfacing in open source tracking, because if Mount Derak wasn't an isolated discovery, there may be a broader pattern of quiet communications infrastructure across the Iranian interior that intelligence has been slowly mapping and eliminating throughout this war. And watch how Shiraz itself factors into reporting going forward, because a city that's now had 2 separate reported military strikes within the same short window has clearly moved onto the target list, in a way almost nobody following this war from the outside anticipated even a few weeks ago. What do you think this actually reveals about how this war is being fought beneath the surface of the headlines everyone's watching? Is Mount Derak a genuinely isolated, obscure target? Or is it a sign that there's a much broader, quieter campaign against Iran's internal communications infrastructure that we're only now getting small, unofficial glimpses of? Drop your honest write on it below, because with satellite imagery, resident accounts, and open source geolocation now converging on a mountain nobody was watching a month ago, I think the next unexpected target to surface in this war might tell us even more than the ones we already know about.